This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. So I'm going to start, Chris, by asking you why you became a journalist.
Well, I kind of fell into it really because I left school at the age of 18 and joined a Catholic seminary. And when people ask me now why I joined a Catholic seminary, I use what they used to call the streaker's defence, which is it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I was there for a little over 3 years and decided it wasn't such a great idea and left. But then emerged into Sydney in the 1980s and into a recession. It was 1982. And in fact, for most of the 1980s, unemployment was on the march. It was about 7%, I think, then, and went all the way up to nearly 11%. So it was a very different time, a very difficult time to get work. And I found that my associate diploma in religious studies, which is all I had gotten so far, didn't really qualify me for anything. So I became a storeman and packer for a while, and eventually I decided I need to get some qualifications. And I went to the Nepean College of Advanced Education, which would go on to be the University of Western Sydney, but it didn't have such an august title then. But I didn't qualify for any of the payments, the government payments at the time, so I had to find work, and so I got work as a security guard, and then eventually, left Sydney in my 1969 Valiant. In 1989, I hadn't wanted to go home, but I had lost yet another job and didn't have anywhere else to go. So I packed everything that I owned into my car, went back to Canberra, started looking for work. It was really, really difficult to find any, and I got a job at the Canberra Times as a copy kid at the age of 29, and that's where it all began. So it was a circuitous path.
So was it a little bit of an accident?
It was an accident.
Have you thought about what might have been?
There were many might have beens, and the 1980s, for personal reasons and other things, were, a kind of decade, my whole 20s, that I'd rather not dwell on, frankly, because so many things. I found after I left the seminary, I constantly tried to make the right choices, or thought I was trying to make the right choices, and made the wrong ones over and over again. So, really, for me, it was at the age of 29 when I made that journey back to Canberra that things started to go right. And from that time on, things went very right. I got very, very lucky. I think I made some good choices, but I also feel like I was genuinely in the right place at the right time.
That's what I wanted to ask you, I guess. When did it kind of click for you? Because, your credentials speak for themselves. This is your calling, it would seem, and I think you might agree with me. When did it click that this was the thing that you should be doing?
One of the priests in the seminary, a guy called Jimmy Esler, who was a tremendous canon lawyer, and what had happened before he was studied in the same year, I think, as Gough Whitlam, so going back a very, very long way. And he had been hopeless at everything, he said, but then he found the law and couldn't do it badly. And it was one of those things, when I got into journalism, I found that it just felt like a natural fit to me. And if I was to draw a line from the seminarian through to the journalist, and people can think what they like about this because people have very low opinion of journalists, but I went into the seminary thinking I was trying to seek the truth, and I went into journalism thinking that was the sort of thing that journalism did. It was in search of some kind of something that was true amidst all of the noise. And so I could see, at least in my own mind, a path through that. Other people can make up their minds about it.
I find that really interesting because I've followed your work for a really long time. We've never met before,
no,
but
met today.
I know a lot about you.
For that.
I've read your stuff. I feel like I know you a little bit through the way that you do your job. It seems to me that you have had a commitment to journalism as a truth-finding mission, but also asking the big moral questions. And I guess that's the line you're drawing between the two things. Like, you're curious about, bigger things than just the daily news and the day of the news and reporting on the news. And that, I was going to ask you actually, is that something that you've grown into? But it seems like it's something that was with you from the beginning.
One thing I do believe very strongly is that most people are good, and that's actually very strong in the Catholic tradition. There are different traditions in the Christian church. Lots of bad things came out of Christianity, lots of good things came out of it. One of the things in Catholic theology is a sense that people are fundamentally good. They might be wounded by sin, the Catholics would say, but they are fundamentally good at heart. To me, I think is a profound insight. I think that people are, and that's been my experience of them. Most of them. And so that's one of the foundation stones for it, and to have an empathy with people as well. The problem with the trade is that it can be really, really hard on people, and in politics in particular, it can be really, really hard on people. And I think the times where I felt I might have failed in my job, and there have been a few times like that, it was when I lost sight of that.
Let me talk to you then about Donald Trump. You had a bit of a moment around Donald Trump. I think it was 2017, a report you did out of, was it the G20? The G7?
It was, yeah, coming off the back of the G20. We'd come from Hamburg and we were in Paris at that stage.
So you did a report, and I might read you back what you probably remember it very vividly, but for the audience's sake, I'll read you back what you said, and perhaps you can reflect on this empathy point a little bit. In it, you said, we learned that Donald Trump has pressed fast forward on the decline of the United States as a global leader. He managed to isolate his nation, to confuse and alienate his allies, and to diminish America. How do you reflect on those statements now? Now we're looking at, a second Donald Trump presidency, perhaps.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. I've not changed my opinion at the time. And I was actually willing to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. In 2016, I'd been in the United States. I'd been down to see the people who follow him. And when you went down to a place like Logan in West Virginia, which has been destroyed by time, the passing of time, by the arbitrage of economics, liberal economics, and by globalisation. The lifestyle that they once enjoyed has completely gone. It's a former coal-fired, coal digging area. It's extremely poor now. It's set in a beautiful setting, but there are burnt out houses in the streets of Logan. It has all the diseases that follow with poverty, morbid obesity, drug abuse, you name it, they've got it. And they felt like they'd been abandoned by both major parties. And Donald Trump didn't appear to them to come from the major parties. He was a vandal. And that's precisely what they want. For them, Donald Trump was a logical choice. They didn't want him to go to Washington and fix it. They wanted him to go to Washington and burn it down. And that's why people think, why do they stick to him? That's all. Everything he does is a proof point of that. That's why they stick to him. And you have to actually understand the lives that they lead and where they've come from. Their real wages haven't increased since the 1970s. The vast majority of the population is unemployed. Their societies have been destroyed. So that's where that visceral rage comes from. So I understood it. I didn't agree with it, but watching him on the world stage as an Australian journalist, from my point of view, the most important thing is the alliances that the United States has built. And I won't dwell on this for too long, but off the back of the Second World War, and for all of the bad things that America has done and the bad choices that it made, which start really in Vietnam, during the First and the Second World Wars, it came to the world's rescue, right? And it set up a whole bunch of institutions that it led that were designed to make sure the world never went back to that really dark place. So that was a great enterprise, right? I want an American president who defends that. Donald Trump is not that person. He has no intention and no desire to lead the free world. He is, to the people who support him in the United States, the tragedy for them is he has a lot of questions that they're asking. He has none of the answers.
Let's look at the opposite, like the other superpowers. Let's look at China. You've had a fair bit to say about China in the past. You've talked about the rise of China as being a threat to the West. It's something that's a massive news theme now, the challenges, the global challenges. I think people listening will be curious about what you see that threat as actually being and where you're at with that. Particularly, I'm talking to you the week where we've had the Premier visit.
Yeah, and so we have to make a big distinction, and I've been guilty in the past of not making this distinction well enough, so I say this up front. There is a big difference between the people of China, who, like all people on earth, are trying to do the best things for their families and their society. They are. That is a fundamental truth. And the Chinese Communist Party, which is a totalitarian group and a criminal organisation. And in the end, in a totalitarian regime, only one man is truly free, and that's Xi Jinping. And China has changed dramatically under Xi Jinping. the thing with China's rise that everyone hoped for and they always talked about was the peaceful rise. With the rise of Xi Jinping, what we see is no, this is a China that is looking to express itself outward as well as inward. But in order for a totalitarian regime to exist, it has to remove all of the threats that might undermine it. Now, the first threat always comes from your own people. I mean, the only real threat to Xi Jinping in the long run is his own people. So what does he do? He puts them in a surveillance society. And we've seen the rise of surveillance in China like nowhere else on earth. It's particularly bad in places like Xinjiang, where a population that the Han Chinese want to keep under their thumb has been horrifically repressed. You see it also in Tibet, but it's everywhere on the streets of China now. People are being monitored. People I know, even the last time I was there, which I think was 2016, things had really changed.
Wow.
Since 2008, and we had that really great sense of hope. The Olympics were on. We went there with Kevin Rudd. I had that sense of hope then about China. Go back then years later, and it was palpable under Xi that the sense of freedom was being eroded, and it's got way worse since then.
Have you been to Hong Kong?
Not since then. I think that was probably the last time I was there.
I do wonder what that would be like as a change.
The hardest thing on earth is to have your liberty taken from you, so I'm sure that they are feeling it greatly, and that's precisely what's happened, and that's what will happen at some stage to Taiwan. Just
before I leave this, I do want to talk to you about Ukraine, and then I want to talk to you about the trade of journalism a little bit more. But where for me you really came to the forefront of my news consumption was during the pandemic, and you became increasingly frustrated with the pandemic and the way that we were responding, and you sort of wrote very freely about that, and you talked very freely about that. Where are you at now on reflection?
Yeah, on reflection, I would double down even more, because the problem that we had was that the entire media became a police force for government. And that really bothered me, because I thought that the first lockdown made sense to me. So when you don't know what the nature of the disease is, then of course you retreat to your homes and you try and work out what it is, and then you try and work out what the best pathway forward is. And so that made sense to me. But once we actually didn't have to get terribly far down the track, and this is before the vaccines came along, it was pretty evident that this was the disease that if you were a woman, for example, under 60, you had more chance of being hit by a car than you did being killed by COVID. That didn't mean you wouldn't get sick. But that did mean that there was a whole cohort, and it wasn't much worse for men. There was a whole cohort of people who were young people who were being forced to lock up because of a disease that threatened older people. Now, through the entire course of human history, and I'm an old person myself now, right? I'm not discounting the importance of old people. I am, but it is, you always, in any society, preference the young over the old. That's the way societies progress. If hurt has to be had, it has to be borne by the older generation, not the younger generation. We took children out of their schools. We locked them up in their homes. And if, you're a baby growing up through that time, we covered people's faces, which is when we will be counting for a generation what we did to those young, because everyone keeps talking about, how fun was it to learn from home? Yeah, sure. If you lived in Vaucluse and you had a good internet connection, and, the kids had more than one computer, what do you think happened in the western suburbs of Sydney, which I spent quite some time living in, most of the 1980s. And I know what the families out there are like. They'd be lucky to have one computer. They'd be doing it on a kitchen table in an environment that doesn't look anything like learning from home. And we're seeing it now. And we're seeing it in every single metric about what happened to that population, the levels of stress, anxiety, and which were already bad because of what we did to them in 2007 with the iPhone. To me, when we get to the stage where we're 2 years into this thing, it was madness, literally madness. And I genuinely believe that we should never again allow one profession, i.e. doctors, to run a response. I think their response was terrible on all in all, and that's why we elect politicians, right, is to take advice from everywhere and then to sift that advice and try and work out what's best for the community.
You were the political editor at Channel 9 during the pandemic, but you finished up towards the end. You say that you were sort of dismayed about the fact that we allowed doctors to sort of run the country. You did sort of mention your profession, though, as well, and the way the media handled it all. How did you feel about that?
Well, for a large part, we were the police force for the government. You know, it was that all of these people who were complaining about vaccine mandates, and look, you know, I said before the whole thing began, if there's a vaccine and it's efficacious and safe and you don't take it, you're an idiot. Because I had two uncles who had polio, so, you know, and saw one who was crippled for life, right? The polio vaccine was a miracle. Vaccines are a miracle. So but that said, I can understand why someone might have an issue with that and decide that they don't want to do that. It's not for me to judge them. You know, when the government basically says it's going to take your job off you if you don't get vaccinated, well, that's a pretty big call. Now, is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. But I shouldn't become the police force for that. And I found it a pretty lonely place at the time. And I was writing for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And, you know, it's on the record, you know, The Age didn't publish one of my comment pieces about what was going on in Victoria with Dan Andrews.
It's a funny thing because I mean, we and everyone listening and certainly us working in media, it's sort of, you don't want to go back there. You kind of, we haven't really reflected that much, I don't think, on that time. But I feel like that's starting to happen now. And as you say, the data is starting to make us reflect on what has happened and what happened to kids and all of that. I think that's starting to happen a little bit more.
Yeah, but the thing is, we should have a Royal Commission, right? If you're going to have a Royal Commission about anything, you'd have a Royal Commission about that.
I did mention that you stepped away from journalism. You had a year off in the end-ish.
Yes, yeah, I did. So
you said you were retiring.
Yeah, I did. So
but you are back.
I meant it. It's a bit like Dame Nellie Melba. So, you know, I might retire again one day and come back again one day. But, you know, you can only do that so many times. I meant it. I was tired, you know, and I think it was maybe part of a post-COVID thing. And you know, my contract with Channel 9 was up. I didn't want to do another 5 years or sign any kind of a contract with anybody. And I wanted to go away and have a bit of a think. And then someone came along and said to me, do you want to make a documentary about Ukraine? Because we've got the money to do it. We don't have someone to present it or write it. And I said, sure, I'm not doing anything else. Seems like a good cause to me.
Chris, you travelled to Ukraine last year. You made a documentary in which you've already mentioned, Forged in Fire, it's called. It was independently made. How did you come to be part of it? Why was it so important for you to come back from retirement and be part of it?
Once again, it starts with doing not anything very much. And then a guy that I knew contacted me and said, there's this company called Screencraft, which is based in Fyshwick in Canberra, that I didn't know anything about, which did mostly advertising and is run by Michael and Justine Fardell. And they had raised money, and it's basically raised by the Ukrainian community to make a documentary about, and it was very specific. What we wanted to do was to make a documentary about the things that Australia was doing for Ukraine, and not just on the Bushmasters, which the government was sending, but how individuals were trying to make a difference. And I had a pretty strong view on the way that that Putin had invaded Ukraine. I don't buy the idea that it was just the expansion of NATO. If you read what he wrote before the war, he essentially doesn't believe that Ukraine exists and intends to take it. He wants to recreate Imperial Russia. And if you speak to people in the Balkan states, they are terrified that once he's finished with Ukraine, that he's coming for them. So I went off to make that, and it was unashamedly pro-Ukrainian exercise.
I was going to ask you, so, and how does that sit with you? Like, how did that sit with you?
Yeah, look, the thing is, I got out of daily journalism, and the things that I intend to do from now on are unashamedly things where I've got a fairly strong view about stuff. And so, you know, and of course, you know, if you go looking for that, you're going to find it, right? If you go looking for something else, you'll find that. So I'm being perfectly frank about it. That was the exercise. But I went looking for the spirit that made the Ukrainian people stand up, and the people that wanted to support them in that. And, you know, and there are now, you know, there's some real issues with President Zelensky, but at the time he had an option. He was given an option by the United States. They would have taken him out of the country. And I'm pretty sure if he hadn't said, you know, I don't want to ride, I need ammo, things would have been very different.
Putting your reporter hat on now, I guess, going to Ukraine, help people listening understand what is it like there?
It's extraordinary. So you can't fly into Ukraine. The airspace obviously is closed. So you have to get a train from Warsaw. That train trip takes 15 hours, and it's one of those things.
So you say that's obvious, but I don't think that would be obvious to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, yeah. You
know? Yeah.
So it doesn't matter who visits there. They go by
15 hours.
Yep. Yeah, and I found out that there were good carriages and bad carriages, and the carriage on the way in was bad. And the toilet at one end was completely destroyed. Happily, there was one at the other end, but it all turned, it was pretty agricultural by the time we got there. So it was this journey into a very different world. But if you go to Kyiv then...
This was mid last year?
Yeah, this was October last year.
Okay.
You would find that it looked like a European city. It was pretty much okay during the day. You've got an app on your phone which tells you, it sounds an alarm and tells you to go to an air raid shelter if there's a missile strike. But at that stage, there weren't that many of them. It happened a couple of times while we were in Kyiv. And you could see the scars in the city where the drones had hit and the missiles had hit. You only had to go 15 k's out before you started to see some of the tremendous damage that had been done. The Russians got very, very close. They got into the suburbs of Kyiv.
Only 15 kilometres.
Yeah, and they were very close to the capital. But then as we headed south and east, the countryside changed quite dramatically, and we got to within 6 kilometres of the front line to meet some of the people in the trenches, and there it looks like Mordor. It is First World War with drones. So, and it is an extraordinary fight. We also, we did this when we were out via the UK, and we met the Australian troops who were training the Ukrainians to fight in these trenches. They're conscripts too, don't forget. So these people get called up to war, and they had to be at that stage over 26 or 27. Now they're starting to lower the age, and what they're doing is what I was talking about before. The reason they don't start conscription at 18 is because they want a next generation.
They want another generation.
Yep.
I encourage people to watch the documentary because it really clearly lays out that these are everyday people learning how to fight in a war. What were you surprised about? Was there anything that shocked you? Was it what you were expecting?
No, I don't. I don't think that. I've only been in or around war zones. I'm not a.
You're not a foreign correspondent. You're a political editor. Yeah.
So I went to Cambodia in 1992.
Yeah.
That was absolutely shocking. So I had some idea of when, as I say, people are basically good, but we're also capable of the most inhumane, like things that you can't possibly begin to imagine that people will be prepared to do to each other. So, seeing the devastation of that, it makes you think. So, and it's little things like you see an apartment building, like an apartment building you'd see in Sydney. The wall's blown out and the refrigerator is hanging literally by the cord. So at some stage it's going to fall. And you think, that's somebody's life, like somebody's house. And, imagine they had hopes and they had dreams like everybody else. And we met people like that. So, but what it was extraordinary and what stands out to me in that is that the courage of people, which is, so when the Russians were invading, you could basically turn up a police station, say, I want a gun, they'd give you one and you can go out and fight. So it's the people organised first. And why? Because they don't want someone to tell them how to live.
And I think you've characterised this war as a war on the West, but also a war on values. And I can hear it. I can hear how passionate you are about this. Explain to people what you think is at stake here.
It's precisely that. It is precisely the choice to be able to live your life within the bounds that any society lays down as freely as you possibly can, to make your own choices, to make your own mistakes, to have that freedom and not have someone else's will imposed on you into every aspect of your life. Look at Xi Jinping's China. If you don't fit into that now, it's a social credit scheme. So if you become any kind of dissident, if you break cover in any way, and that could be something you said online, you start to lose points, you can't catch a bus. You can't commune with the rest of society. You're under surveillance. Who wants to live like that? And so it is what President Zelensky said to us in the interview. What is life without freedom, without the ability to choose what you want, where you want to go? What is it? It's nothing. That's the choice. Like I say, there are a lot of problems with democracies. There are. We all know that. But at least we have that modicum of freedom which allows us to make enough choices for us to lead a life that we want to lead, not one that someone wants to impose.
And how do you think that fight's going?
Look, I think it's
we're 2 years in, aren't we? Now, over 2 years in.
Yeah, in Ukraine, I fear for them. The only end in it is a diplomatic end. The problem is the West has given enough for them to be able to sustain the fight without giving enough to be able to win the fight. I don't know if it was ever winnable. It would have been good if they had got to a position where they were on the front foot and then started to sue for peace rather than having been pushed back. I worry that the gains that have been made, I don't think ever get returned. President Zelensky would say that they're not going to give up on that land and they're going to continue to fight. In the end, there has to be a point where there's some kind of diplomatic settlement. That diplomatic settlement will undoubtedly see some territory ceded to Ukraine. I can't see how it ends any other way. I want it to end. I met those recruits, and I also now know people in Ukraine who are under recruitment age, and I hope it ends before they get called up.
What is the toll now?
In the hundreds of thousands, but neither side will tell you. And there's a massive toll of young Russians as well, and I don't know necessarily that that's the way that they want to end their lives. And so, but clearly, it's not just Putin's fight. Clearly, there's a long tradition in Russia of having as much concern about what comes from the West as we would have, because what came from the West was Napoleon. What came from the West was Hitler. So, Putin's managed to convince them that NATO falls into that kind of category, and I think that there would be a large percentage of the population that probably is signed up to this as a war that is necessary. So I think it might go more deeply than Vladimir Putin, but certainly he's the architect of this whole thing. And again, this is what comes, as I say, I basically believe in the decency of humanity, but I also believe there is such a thing as evil. And it's expressed in people who want to control another person. That could be in a relationship. That could be the person who wants to control the way that you live. Or that could be someone who wants to control the way that everybody lives. It's the same impulse. It's
the same impulse. It's just at what scale is it? Is it implemented, I guess? Just to finish on the Ukraine question, you deliberately were involved because, and as you've mentioned, because it was about connecting Australians with Ukraine and the experience there. Was the intention to sort of put it on the map a little bit more here? And do you think we're doing a good job of paying attention to that conflict and to that war?
Well, the thing is that what it does is when you have that kind of immediate threat, it strips things down to their very barest, which is live or die, liberty or death, and you understand what's worthwhile in life and what you're prepared to fight for and die for. Now, the thing that I want, I guess, to get across to Australians is we're living in a really interesting time in the West. There are people who question the very foundation stones of the institutions on which we stand because they have a history. And some of that history is very bad. There is not a shadow of a doubt that the original sin of settlement in Australia is dispossession, and that must be settled. But the great thing about a democracy is its capacity to reflect and correct. That's what makes it a better system than others. But, in 2024 in Australia, I wonder what it is that we think we are as Australians. What are the things that we value? What are the things we actually all agree on? We're pretty clear now, I think, on what we all disagree on. But what are the foundation stones? And that's what I say about losing that sense of purpose. So we had a sense of self. And I do think that we have lost a sense of that. We need to have it, because the issue now is not with China and it's not with Russia, because superpowers will do what superpowers do. We need to be strong enough to know what we stand for in order to fight what they stand for. We need to find the ground under our feet in order to be able to stand strong. And I don't think that we could articulate, I don't hear anyone articulating what it is to be an Australian.
And is it the responsibility of our political leaders to settle that sentiment?
It's our responsibility as citizens to help settle that sentiment.
Do you see anyone articulating it? I mean, you just said there's no one articulating it clearly, the Prime Minister, the opposition leader. Do you see anyone really leading that sense of value, of what it means to be an Australian and sort of a guiding light, I guess?
Yeah, and I think that the unfortunate thing about this is it's just become another battleground, and when you start talking about these things, it tends to be something that, gets written up a lot on the right and dismissed by those in the left, right? So that no, that's not true. None of that actually matters. But, I remember sitting down years ago with Clive Hamilton, who used to run the Australia Institute, and Clive was a really, really very, very effective left-wing firebrand. He ran the Australia Institute. He was extreme, I thought, on climate change. No, he was an absolute warrior, and he called me. I liked him though. He called me one day and said, "Look, we need to meet for breakfast." And I thought, "Oh God, I've done something where Clive's going to lecture me about
something."
This is something, and we're going to disagree again. And he said, "I'm really worried about China." And I said, "Oh, right, so am I." He said, "I know, and so we need to talk about that."
What I'm hearing from you in saying that is there are inevitably going to be things that unite us across political lines, across political divides. However, I'm interested in the point that you make about disagreeing, and how do you make sure that you are disagreeing and that I assume as a journalist you want to be disagreeing. How do you make sure you're challenged and your views are challenged?
I got married to Gay Brotman.
I was hoping you might say that. I'm glad you brought her up. But you're married to a former Labor politician.
Yep, that's right.
And I'm sure you don't. I've often wondered, knowing that, how often you disagree.
Well, the thing is about it is she doesn't come from a religious background at all, so she's quite different from me on that front. But she has the best human values in anyone I've ever met. So you won't meet a better person, someone who tries harder to do the right thing. That is absolutely ingrained in her. Because Gay has such a great depth of humanity, she helps me look at things in different ways.
You're now at Sky News and The Australian. News Corp's a place you've been quite critical of, actually, in the past.
Yes.
Or perhaps maybe that's not the right way to put it. Just
true.
Actually, News Corp, it actually was News Corp as a whole entire organisation, less so the actual individual journalists and less so the individual reporting. You did say to me, though, that you are interested in being somewhere where you can more opine than report. How do you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, so the thing is that when you're reporting, and I think that the best advice I ever got from an editor was the first one I had, Crispin Hull, was when I finally get the job, get the cadetship, and he said two things: be fair and be accurate. And I think that I would add to that: be fair, be accurate, be clear in the way that you write. Learn to try and master the English language and understand that there are different dialects in doing it. So if you're writing for a newspaper, a news report, it's different from doing a radio news story, and doing radio current affairs is different from doing radio news, and doing television current affairs is different because you add pictures. So I think in doing daily journalism, what you have to understand is what your biases are. Everybody has them. There is no such thing as a entirely objective world. That doesn't exist. But you can attempt to try and understand what people are talking about and accurately and clearly reflect what they're trying to say. That, to me, is reporting. And the problem in the ABC is that you're allowed to do analysis, but you're not allowed to do opinion. This is a very fine line.
So that's the line I'm interested in. And I think, this is News Club. This is the place to go for conversations about the news. This is an audience of people and people listening who are very conscious of what they're reading and whether they can trust it or not. And a lot of the reasons that they come to us at the Squiz is to go, we don't have an agenda we're going to push. You can trust us. We don't try and blur the lines between opinion and reporting and opinion and fact, and we just don't do that. How do you see that now? for a consumer? Like, how would you say, come to Chris Uhlmann for reporting on this, come to Chris Uhlmann for a commentary on this? Do you think they're two distinct things, or do you think you're more of an analyst, I guess, in the ABC sense of the word?
I am much more on the... I absolutely am in the opinion sense of the word at the moment, is in the sort of twilight of my career. So that's
a clear delineation.
Yeah, it is, because the thing is, analysis in the ABC, come on, it's somebody's opinion, right? It's just you've got to be very careful about the way that you express it. And I certainly was guilty of transgressing at times when I was in the ABC, as I was reminded. But in any event, the thing I think you need to do is read widely. Unfortunately, and there's an entire other conversation, is what we have seen with since 2007, when the internet went in everyone's pocket, the broadcasting world and the print world changed forever. Because what happened was the big barriers to entry in broadcasting were always money. So, it costs money for a printing press and distribution networks to put out a newspaper. It costs money to get satellite time to do television. All of a sudden,
anyone can do it.
The price drops to zero and everyone's doing it. The only thing I would say is you are way worse than we ever were. You say things and do things online that we were never allowed to do. So it's great. I can go to conferences now where people talk about terrible journalists and they say you're all journalists and you're really bad at it.
So what do you have? I mean, I laugh, but it's really not funny because
it's not funny
news
at
is
all.
incredibly challenged. What do you think the greatest challenge is? I'll ask you that, and then I'll ask you, what do you think the opportunities might be?
The greatest challenge is the collapse of the commercial media. Might think, that doesn't really matter. We've got the ABC. You need way more than the public broadcaster in terms of having a good, healthy ecosystem. If you're in the United States, you will always have some organ that's commercial that will survive, like the New York Times. I've subscribed to that. I subscribe to the Washington Post. I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. There are people like me around the world that do that. So they'll always have a big subscriber base. So they'll survive. In Australia, no one external to Australia is buying, the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age or the Australian. So it has to survive on the dollars that are raised here. In the advertising world now, online, 80% of the revenue goes to Google and to Facebook, which means that 20% that's left. So what's happened, we've seen a catastrophic collapse in the commercial media in Australia. And at the same time, because everyone's searching for eyeballs, although those organisations already did tilt in one direction or the other, they've pitched to their audience. So everyone's now living inside their own little ghetto and they only want to hear from the people who think like them. So the only thing I can say to people is to read as widely as you possibly can, because then you'll get some sense from everyone as to, what's actually going on. And I think there's still, and I tend to follow journalists in places and the different organs and know that they're good and try to read as widely as I possibly can. And also, I consume a lot of international media. The one hope for the mainstream media, and I think it does need to survive, because I think we've seen in the States with the complete collapse of the state-based political galleries there, what happens in states when there aren't journalists around. So I just... I really hope that there might be some sort of flight to quality, that people will think, I will pay for this because I know at least they have had a crack at trying to prove whether or not it's true before they published it. But boy, it's going to become really hard. We will not be able to know what is real online. It's like that stuff I talked about at the beginning, realists and idealists. Now we're in an age where people can completely recreate you, for example, and put words in your mouth which you never said, and make it almost impossible for us to tell whether you said it or not. And that's going to be an extremely challenging world.
We're nearly at the end, Chris, but I wanted to ask you, and as I promised, I would ask you, what are you hopeful about?
I always have hope in the goodwill of most people, that eventually that we will bend more towards good than towards ill, that most people want to do good by their families and good by their neighbours, and that's where it all starts. It has to start with individual relationships. And if most people weren't good, the world wouldn't function at all. We would all drive recklessly on the roads. We would all walk across traffic lights when they were red. It is every single day in a multitude of ways people go about their lives and try and do it in such a way that does no harm to others, and a great many of them try and find ways where they can do good for others, and on very small and very large ways every single day. And I think that's true of all people, So I am optimistic that part of human nature will triumph, but I don't discount the idea that there is such a thing as evil, and that there are genuinely people who've made a decision that they will be evil in life and do mean harm. And I think that when that comes, good people have to fight, because if good people don't fight, bad people will win. That might sound a bit simplistic, but I think that's very true. And so we do need to know what we stand for. And when push comes to shove, we do need to step up.